Good evening. Today is November the 13th, which means we are less than a year away from re-electing President Biden and Vice President Harris. There's a lot happening right now, right this very minute, that we should all be paying attention to. And we're going to be talking about some of those things this evening, but our primary focus is on how to help caregivers. So many of us are caregivers in our country, and that's our topic on tonight's The Hamilton Report. I'm delighted that you have tuned in this evening. I always appreciate it when our friends tune in on Mondays. I know that everyone's schedule is so busy, so the fact that you take half an hour to spend with us on Monday evenings, I can't tell you enough how very appreciative we are that you tune in. And before I forget, I oftentimes don't mention this, and that's just because I usually forget at the end of the show. But our chair, Alicia Andrews, does a live update every day, Monday through Friday at 4:15. You can watch it wherever you're watching this broadcast, either on our Facebook page or our YouTube page, because that's a way to get quick updates. Usually they're 10 to 15 minutes long, but it's important news that you need to know. Well, tonight, Marjorie Taylor Greene is calling for the firing or the impeachment or whatever it is she's calling it now of Secretary Mayorkas. Just another stunt in a week that is barreling toward a government shutdown. So the priorities in Congress are so backwards, so upside down, just they're missing any sense of intelligent life. And we see that being played out. But I guess the best thing I read last week about Marjorie Taylor Greene is that she is now calling Lauren Boebert a whore, which I think is pretty funny given they both have very similar track records. But I'll just leave that one right there. Today is a day that's set aside in our country to offer appreciation and recognition to caregivers. As our population ages, more and more of us are seeing ourselves in the role of caregiver for another adult or for children or for a combination. As a matter of fact, 16.6% of our population cares for an adult over the age of 50 with a disability or an illness. Now, these are unpaid caregivers. And if we were to put a price tag on this, it would be in the billions, high billions of dollars on if we had to pay for the kind of care that's being afforded by people who do that as a part of their daily lives, care for other adults. And when I was looking at doing this episode, I got to thinking about who would be the best person to talk about the depth of this issue and what it means and how we can be supportive of caregivers and how caregivers can be supportive of themselves, some self-care. And I can think of no better person than my guest tonight, Dr. Lisa Frey. Lisa, I am so happy to see you. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. I think this is a very important topic.
I agree with you. And I should point out that Lisa and I have worked together. As a matter of fact, I think the last project that we were working on was trying to get more men's beds in domestic violence shelters. Mm-hmm. And Lisa is just not only an incredible educator, but an integral part of the community in Norman. Her work has made a substantial difference in the lives of many, many people. And so I'm delighted that she could be with us this evening.
That's a lovely thing to say.
Well, it's all true. 43.5% of Americans have cared for an adult over 50 or a child in the last year, unpaid. But when it comes to just adults, 34.2 million of us are caring for another adult. Lisa, these numbers are high, but as we see our population age, this means an explosion in the need for caregivers.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we just before the show, you mentioned something that I've been aware of, but not so um, so clearly as you said. Would you talk a little bit about the differences and responsibilities based on culture?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a lot of differences that are based on racial, ethnic, and cultural groups, especially related to privilege and advantage and how marginalized or minoritized a particular individual or group is. And that definitely affects things like caregiving and
Mhm.
the ability to care for oneself as a caretaker. Um, for example, financial disadvantage impacts the ability to hire external care providers and get respite if you're a caregiver. Estrangement from a biological family because of your identity or because of conflicts within the family certainly can limit family participation in caregiving. Access to medical care. We all know that race and ethnicity and identity status affects quality of, sadly, affects quality of medical care and even access to medical care. So those things can certainly impact also caregiving. So there are a myriad number of ways that those ideas of privilege and power affect the ability to be a caregiver and affect the kind of support that a caregiver is provided.
And it's very interesting to me that in the height of the AIDS epidemic, and this was born out of absolute necessity, there were so many support groups. There were
Mhm.
support groups for survivors, support groups for people who were in the last stages of their illness, support for discordant couples where one person was HIV positive, the other one not, and just caregiver support groups. But as we began to manage that crisis more fully, those resources began to dwindle.
Mhm.
And I was thinking about that in terms of COVID because we still have people with long-term COVID, but that represents a big challenge because if you are caring for someone with COVID and you're in the house, chances are real good that you're going to get sick too. So
Absolutely.
we're dealing at a different time today, and Americans are working later in life than ever before. Um, so what does this mean in terms of how do we begin to balance out just being an adult or in many cases a senior adult with the daily responsibilities of caregiving for a loved one? How that I mean, for some of us, we even making that distinction between work life and home life can be tricky.
Mhm.
But once we're in a position where caregiving is such a focus in our lives, how in the world do we begin to carve out a way for us to take care of ourselves?
I really think that you touched on it before when you talked about the systems of care that were sort of a grassroots effort and developed out of the AIDS epidemic. And many of those have melted away. We need those kinds of systems of care again, I think, for just things have only gotten more complicated, right? So, for example, if you're caring for an adult who has a high level of medical needs or a child that has a high level of medical needs, navigating the healthcare system is a nightmare anymore. I mean, having done some caregiving myself within my family, there are so many ways that can become so complicated.
Yeah.
So we need systems that can help with people that can be helpful in navigating and advocating for care within the healthcare system and can be coordinating care, because one of the biggest problems I see in our healthcare system now is there's no coordination.
Oh, that is so true. And if there's no coordination for the patient, then there are zero resources for the caregiver.
Absolutely. And I started out prior to going to school to be a psychologist. This, I was an RN. So I have experience in the medical system too. And it's difficult to navigate. I had an experience with a friend, I don't want to give too much information, out of state last week, who is having some cognitive issues and had to have the nurse, the advanced practice nurse, call me, her friend, to give her, in a different state, to give them the prescriptions that they were on, and to help my friend to understand the directions that the physician was giving them, because the physician wouldn't call her primary care physician. Does that make sense? I mean, there was no talking to each other. It went through me. It's just not a sustainable system in that way to provide people with good care.
So
I'm
just thinking about that. And I mean, my husband is a smart man. I have to tell that like it is. But when it came to looking at Medicare Advantage programs,
yes,
I mean, a bed full of literature.
Yes.
That it's like, how in the world can one person figure this all out?
Right.
And that's just to get the coverage.
Right.
So, yeah, there is no coordination. And, and let's be honest, Oklahoma is losing a lot of young people because of the politics in this state. So that's going to leave even more people without appropriate in-home care.
We're losing there's a lot of mental health providers leaving because of the health information exchange too. So it's just gotten very complicated. Just imagine systemically how wonderful it would be if there were, I don't know what you would call them, medical advocates or medical navigators that would work with somebody that was a caregiver to try to help them figure out those kinds of things about insurance, or help them to make sure information gets communicated among their 10 different physicians. Make sure they're taking the right medications. Yeah.
That kind of service would be a godsend to so many people. I was thinking about this. If someone is diagnosed with, let's say, diabetes, okay, well, there's one kind of diet for that. But then there are kidney issues. Well, that's a whole different kind of diet. So how do you balance those two? And, yes, we can go online and try to source all this out. But like you said, if we had an advocate, someone that could say, okay, here's a cooking class that you really ought to take because it's fun and you'll learn something and it'll get you out of the house for 2 hours.
Yes.
That would be very helpful.
Absolutely would. On a more individual level with caregivers, I also think about things like probably the most important thing we can give them is time. You're so isolated when you're in that role, and the more hours you have to devote to a care recipient, the more isolated you tend to become. So, and what we have a tendency to do, I think, is to ask people for what they need. Well, what can I do? Well, you and I both know when you get busy and people say, well, what can I do? You're like, well, I'll just do it myself. It's harder to explain to you what I have to do. So it works much better if we just say to somebody, a caregiver, I would like to sit with your mother, your grandmother, your father, your child, for 10 minutes today, or a half an hour today, or an hour today. Let's talk about what you could do with that time.
I love that. And that's something most all of us can afford to do.
We absolutely can. I think we sometimes forget that even if you're a caregiver, 5 minutes is meaningful. 5 minutes to go sit outside and be by yourself, or to take a walk around the block. And most of us can spend more than 5 minutes if we really wanted to carve out the time.
Absolutely. And I really like that idea because that's actually something that could be done in in our own communities. I mean,
Yes,
wherever we live, your neighbor, your friend upstairs, like you said, that means a lot. That gift of time is
yes,
precious. You also raised another issue, or you started down that road. You're talking about being isolated as a caregiver.
right.
Well, that we know can cause health issues for
Absolutely.
anyone. So it leads to higher levels of depression.
Mhm.
It lends itself to substance use,
Yes.
and so now we've got a caregiver that's not being cared for in the right way. So that caregiver is not doing as well as they should be with the one they're caring for. It's really, as we're talking about this, I'm realizing more and more what a heavy burden this is for folks.
It is. And perhaps this comes from being a psychologist, but I feel that some of this is about not listening to people enough and what their challenges are. If you're a caregiver, it's a it's very complicated. It can be very complicated. You have a relationship sometimes with the care recipient that may be great, but it may not be. It may be troublesome. It may be complicated. It may be um, things that have never been resolved between you and the recipient. And for some recipients, they're at a point it's never going to be resolved. If you are somebody with Alzheimer's and your caretaker is somebody that you had a problematic relationship with, when you have dementia, that's not the time your caregiver is going to be able to resolve these things with you.
Right.
So we need to listen to caregivers and encourage them to talk about those complicated relationships and maybe resentments that they have about having to provide care. Those things are all normal reactions.
But where do people have a chance to express that?
Yeah. And people don't often, it's not that their friends and so forth maybe don't want to hear it. They just don't know how to ask, but they do need to ask. There's also some really good support groups out there that can be very helpful. So I think
Let's talk
something,
about those.
yeah, okay. I think one thing that would be very helpful for caregivers is if friends and family offer to sit with the care recipient while they go to a support group. There's online support groups, there's in-person support groups. I actually did a list, and I've tried to put it here on the chat, but I'm not getting the whole thing. So you and I can talk about how to best get that out to people.
Okay.
But I do have a list of a number of places that can provide resources, including support groups. And some of them are sort of general. Some of them are located in Oklahoma. Some of them are located elsewhere in the United States. Some of them are specific to ethnic and ethnic, racial, and other cultural groups. There's a Black Caregiver Association, for example. There are some resources for Indigenous people, specific to Indigenous people. So if we can figure out how to get that to you, I think she's putting some of those across the bottom there, but I have a lot more. So if we can get those to you, I'd be happy.
Absolutely. And we will make those resources available because I think it's so important that we don't leave people out there feeling like they're all alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, part of that is the caregiver's mentality too, right?
Mhm.
You get absorbed in what you're doing and you don't think about the need to take care of yourself. You sort of forget about the idea. When we take a plane ride, what do they say when they tell you if the oxygen drops down? Put it on yourself first and then on the other person. When you're a caregiver, you tend to forget sometimes that taking care of yourself is for you, but it's also for the person that you're caring for.
That is so right.
Yeah.
Now, how would you suggest families become more involved in caregiving? When I say families, I mean more of an extended family,
Mhm.
um, because I mean there are lots of young people that could definitely go sit with a grandparent for an afternoon.
Yes. I think that for one thing, that's good for the care recipient, right? To
Mhm.
be exposed to other people besides this one person all the time. So
Right.
I absolutely agree with you. I think one way to do that is to have a family meeting if you can and sort of divvy up all the different things that need to be done. So perhaps there's somebody that is the primary caretaker in the home. They live with the care recipient, but they don't have to do everything. There might be somebody that can do the shopping. There might be somebody that can come in and cook a certain number of times a week. There might be somebody that can come in, um, a teen in the family and play game
Mhm.
with the care recipient a few times a week. I think you can divide up tasks. Somebody that always takes the person to the physician. I think you can divide up tasks in that way and involve the whole family, and then it reduces the load on the caregiver, which is really part of care for the caregiver, right?
Yes, it is. But in that case, it helps both the person being
Yeah,
cared for and the caregiver. And I like when you said the same person is responsible for going to all the doctor visits because at least you have
right.
some continuity there.
Yes. Now I think that's a really helpful thing to do that kind of task separation. But I would say that if you do that in a family, there has to be someone that makes sure they get everybody together once a month or whatever, and you're communicating information to each other
Right.
so that everybody knows what everybody else has done. If you're out of lettuce or if
Sure.
whatever it is, if there's a new medication, that all needs to be communicated.
Well, that's yeah, and I really do like that idea. We were talking a moment ago about families of choice
Yes.
and or our group of friends that become family in
Right.
a very real way. Is Has caregiving changed um, among that group of folks? Has it become um, are more people involved in it, or is it still pretty lonely?
That's really an interesting question. I would say, I think for some people, for example, for LGBTQ folks,
Uh huh.
that is for some, not all, that's all they have to rely on. And they have very close knit families of choice.
Right.
And so in certain populations, I really have no statistics to back this up, but I would say in certain populations, there is definitely that is definitely continuing to happen. And I think a lot of that has to do maybe with cultural messages. I think I had mentioned to you I was traveling a year and a half ago or something, and I was talking to a woman that was working setting up the continental breakfast at the hotel I was staying at. She was an African American woman, and she was well past retirement age. And we were talking about that. We were talking about retirement because I saw too, I'm probably well past retirement age. But she was telling me she took care of her grandchildren. They lived with her, and she had a number of them in the house. She took care of a grandparent, and she was working full time to support the family.
Mm,
So, did family members help her? Absolutely. They were all living with her. They had to help
sure.
her. But it's still a lot because there are not always systems in place,
Mhm.
institutional systems to support that sort of really wonderful caregiving.
W- Other than the resources that we've just talked about, Lisa, the bringing families into this process, what advice do you have for caregivers in how to say, time out? I really need a break.
I think there's a couple things. I think the first thing I would say is that I think it's very important for caregivers to be honest with themselves and identify their personal barriers to self-care, to
Mhm.
asking for help. What gets in their way? Have they always had a problem with asking for help? Have they learned from their family that it's selfish to put
Interesting.
your own needs first? I think it's important to think through those individual barriers that we each have to be able to do what you need to do to be not only healthy as a caregiver, but to be healthier in the care that you're giving the care recipient. So I think that is one thing I guess I think that's really a key issue that's important. Okay, now go back and remind me of what the question was, because I know I
No,
answered one and I said there were two things, but I can't remember.
no, you answered it well. I was asking about uh, what advice do you give to caregivers who've got to take a break?
Oh, that's right. Okay. I do think an important part of that is thinking through why they can't,
Mhm.
why. And if the reason they can't is because there's nobody around them that's willing to help, then that is a time to go to a support group or go and seek some help and really figure out how to get more assistance into that relationship so that you can take a break. If you don't take a break, you're going to get ill.
Yeah, and it
And there's
will
going to
happen.
be two people in need
It
of
will
care.
happen.
Yeah.
Well, our time is almost up, but I want to point out something that you shared with me, and that's that 75% of caregivers in this country
Mhm.
are women. Um, that's not that's not a big surprise because of women's roles in our culture.
Mhm.
Traditionally, have just kind of made that a thing. But I'd like to challenge our male viewers to pay particular attention to the females in your life who are just wearing themselves down by
Yes.
caring for a loved one.
Mhm.
Pay attention to that, folks, because we can all do a little bit. It's very interesting that in addition to this being Caregiver Recognition Day, it's also National Kindness Day.
Mm.
So I guess the bigger challenge is for all of us to find a way to be a little kinder, to be more able to give of ourselves as we struggle with an aging population.
Right.
And I'm feeling it more and more every day when I wake up. It's a little slower about hitting the floor, and I know that that's true for so many of us.
And it's not going to stop because if you look at the projections of what's going to happen in our population, caregiving is only going to increase exponentially.
Yeah,
We
it
have to do a
absolutely.
better job. Yeah.
Well, Lisa, you've given us so much to think about tonight, and
Good.
I'd like to continue this discussion. If you will be kind enough to send me this list of resources, we will make it available in our office online because it really is our goal to help folks so that everybody can find a level of happiness and just feel supported in their daily lives. That's, I think, the most one of the most beautiful gifts we can give someone.
I agree. And I think what we're put on earth for, this is my personal philosophy, is relationship, authentic relationship and connection. Yeah.
And it's time we get back to focusing on that a little more and a little less time online. Spoken
That's
like the
weird.
old guy.
Send me your email, by the way, and I will send you an attachment with the resource list on there.
Okay, Lisa, thank you so much. This has been really helpful. You've given us a lot to think about, and I look forward to seeing you soon, my friend.
Same to you. I enjoyed it, and thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Well, friends, we've said a lot in this half hour. I hope that it's resonating for you. if you are a caregiver, I hope that you will reach out and seek the support that you need. And if you know someone who's a caregiver, pay particular attention to how they're navigating life and the challenges that go with caregiving. Certainly, there are a lot of joys that can go with caregiving as well, but both joy and challenge require energy. So we need to look out for one another. We are completely out of time tonight. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you. And on behalf of Alicia Andrews and all of us at the Oklahoma Democratic Party, I'm Scott J. Hamilton saying thank you and good night.